Hello, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. For 10 long years, the greatest army the ancient world had ever gathered sat outside a single city, unable to break in. Thousands of ships had crossed the sea to reach it. Kings had left their thrones to join the siege, and through all of it, one man stood on the high stone wall and refused to let his home fall. He was not the strongest fighter in the war. He was not even the reason the war began. Yet when people spoke of the defense of Troy, they spoke first of him. If you find these slow walks through history restful, you might take a quiet moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments. There is something gentle about knowing that someone in another city, in another hour of the night, is settling in to hear the same story you are. It helps other sleepless people find their way here too. So get comfortable, let your shoulders rest, and let yourself drift slowly into the long story of Hector of Troy. His name has come down to us across more than 3,000 years. We know him today mostly from a single great poem, the Iliad, written by the Greek poet Homer somewhere around the 8th century BC. But the events the poem describes were already ancient even then. They belong to a much older world, the Late Bronze Age, a time of warlords and walled palaces that had collapsed centuries before Homer was born. So Hector lives in a strange in-between place. He is half history and half memory, a figure remembered long after the world that made him had crumbled into ruins and grass. In the story, Hector is the eldest son of Priam, the king of Troy. He is the crown prince, the man who would one day inherit the throne if the city survived. He is married, with a young son, and he is the commander of the Trojan army. That last role is the one that defines him. While his younger brother chased trouble and his father grew old, it was Hector who carried the weight of the war on his back. The poets who told his tale gave him a single repeated description. They called him Hector, tamer of horses. It was a plain compliment for a plain kind of man, someone steady, useful and reliable, the sort you would want holding the gate when everything else was falling apart. What makes Hector unusual, even now, is that he is the enemy of the heroes we are supposed to cheer for, and yet he is the one most people end up loving. The Iliad is told mostly from the Greek side. The Greeks are the ones who sailed across the sea to attack Troy, and the poem follows their greatest warrior, a man named Achilles. By every rule of storytelling, Hector should be the villain. He fights against the heroes, he kills people we have come to know, and still, when you reach the end of his story, it does not feel like the defeat of a villain at all. It feels like the loss of a good man who was simply on the wrong side of fate. Part of the reason is that Hector wanted none of this. The war did not start because of him. It started because of his brother, a careless and charming young prince named Paris, who brought home another man's wife from across the sea. Hector saw the danger at once. He understood that one selfish act could bring an entire civilization down on top of his family. He said so, openly and more than once. But he could not undo what had been done, and so he did the only thing a man in his position could do. He picked up his spear and went out to defend his people from a war he had argued against from the very beginning. To understand him properly, it helps to step back from the legend for a moment and look at the world he came from. The city we call Troy was real. For a long time, scholars thought it was pure invention, a beautiful fiction with no more truth in it than a fairy tale. Then, in the 1870s, a wealthy and rather single-minded German named Heinrich Schliemann began digging into a mound in what is now western Turkey, near the mouth of the Dardanelles Strait. Beneath the soil he found the remains of a city. Not one city, in fact, but many, built one on top of another across thousands of years, each new town raised on the rubble of the last. The place is called Hisarlik today, and most experts now accept that this layered hill is the Troy of the old stories, or at least the closest thing to it that ever stood in the real world. The Troy of the Bronze Age was no small village. It sat on a low rise above a fertile plain, within sight of the sea, guarding the narrow waterway that connected the Aegean to the Black Sea. Whoever controlled that passage controlled a great deal of trade, which meant that Troy was wealthy, and wealthy cities make tempting targets. The walls that Schliemann and later archaeologists uncovered were thick and sloping, built of fitted stone, the kind of fortification that could hold off an army for a very long time. When you hear the old poets describe Hector pacing the great walls of Troy, it turns out they were not exaggerating. The walls were genuinely there. We do not know whether a man named Hector ever truly lived. There is no inscription with his name, no tomb we can point to with certainty, no record outside the poems. He may have been entirely imagined. He may have been built from the memory of several real war leaders, blended together over centuries of retelling until they became a single person. Or there may once have been a flesh and blood prince who defended a real city against a real attack, whose deeds slowly grew into legend. The honest answer is that nobody can say for sure, and anyone who tells you otherwise is guessing with more confidence than the evidence allows. What we can say is that the story of Hector has outlasted almost everything else from his age. The kings who ruled beside him are forgotten. The exact borders of the kingdoms have dissolved. The languages they spoke have gone silent, but the image of one man standing on a wall, defending the people behind it, has survived every collapse and every dark age since. That is a rare kind of immortality, and Hector earned it without ever winning his war. Over the next 10 chapters of this story, we will follow his whole life as the old tradition gives it to us. We will walk through the streets of his city before the war, meet his family, and see the foolish spark that set everything alight. We will watch the Greek fleet arrive on the beach and settle in for a siege that would grind on for a decade. We will sit with Hector in the quiet moments, with his wife and his small son, in the brief hours when he was a husband and a father rather than a soldier. And then we will follow him out onto the plain, into the great battles, toward the single combat that would decide his fate and the fate of his city. It is, in the end, a sad story. Most of the truly memorable ones are, but it is also a calm one, in its way, because it is about doing your duty steadily even when you can see how it is likely to end. Hector was not a man who believed he would win. He simply believed it was better to stand than to run, and he kept standing right up until the moment he could stand no longer. So let the modern world fall away for a while. Picture a city of pale stone on a low hill, a wide plain stretched out before it, and beyond the plain a grey sea crowded with ships. The wind is coming off the water, the towers are lit by the last of the evening sun, and a man in bronze is walking the wall, looking out at the army that has come to destroy his home, the citadel above the wind. Long before the first Greek ship appeared on the horizon, Troy was simply a good place to live and an even better place to grow rich. To understand why armies were willing to cross the sea and die for it, you have to understand where it sat. The city stood near the western edge of Asia Minor, the great landmass that is modern Turkey, on a low ridge overlooking a flat coastal plain. Just beyond that plain ran a narrow ribbon of water known in those days as the Hellespont, and known now as the Dardanelles. It is one of the most important stretches of sea anywhere in the world, because it is the only way in and out of the Black Sea by ship. That narrow channel was the secret of Troy's wealth. The current in the Dardanelles runs strong and steady from the Black Sea toward the Aegean, pushing against any vessel that wants to sail the other way. On top of that, the prevailing winds in summer blow from the north, straight down the throat of the passage. For a sailing ship of the Bronze Age, with a single square sail and oars worked by tired men, this combination could be impossible to fight. Captains heading north often had no choice but to anchor and wait, sometimes for days or weeks, until the wind and water relented enough to let them through. And while they waited, they needed somewhere to land, to buy food, to mend ropes, and to trade. Troy was that somewhere. It controlled the waiting room of the ancient sea, and it charged for the privilege, This is also why the old poets so often called it windy Troy. It was not a decoration or a poetic mood. The wind really did pour over that plain almost constantly, and anyone standing on the high walls would have felt it tugging at their cloak. For once, the epithet was just plain weather reporting. The city itself was built in two parts. On the ridge stood the citadel, a fortified upper town ringed by those famous sloping walls of fitted limestone. This was the royal heart of Troy, where the palace stood, where the king and the noble families lived, and where the people would crowd in times of danger. The walls leaned inward as they rose, a clever design that made them harder to climb and harder to undermine, and they were pierced by a small number of strong gates. Inside, the houses were built in the style of the age, long rectangular halls called megarons, each with a central hearth and a porch at the front. Below the citadel, spreading out across the lower slope, lay a much larger town where most ordinary people actually lived. For a long time, scholars badly underestimated how big this lower city was, picturing Troy as little more than a small fortress. More recent digging has revealed defensive ditches and traces of dwellings stretching far beyond the citadel walls, suggesting a settlement that may have held several thousand people. By the standards of its day, Troy was a substantial city, not a mere stronghold. The wealth flowing through the place left its mark. Archaeologists have found imported pottery, ornaments of gold and bronze, and signs of busy workshops. The Trojans seem to have traded in textiles and in horses, which fits neatly with the way Homer remembers them, for the city was famous for its horsemanship, and Hector's own standing title was Tamer of Horses. A people who raised and trained fine horses, on a plain perfectly suited to it, would have been wealthy and well known for exactly that. The legend and the dirt agree on this point, which does not happen as often as you might hope. There is one more piece of the puzzle, and it comes from an unexpected source. The Bronze Age was not a quiet world of isolated towns. It was a connected world of great powers, and the greatest power in that region was the Hittite Empire, which ruled much of Asia Minor from its capital deep in the interior. The Hittites were diligent record keepers, and they wrote on clay tablets that survived being baked hard when their archives burned. Among those tablets are references to a kingdom on their western frontier that they called Wilusa. Most historians now believe that Wilusa is the same place the Greeks called Ilios, an older name for Troy that survives in the very title of the Iliad. The Hittites also wrote of a powerful seafaring people they called the Ahiyawa, a name that sounds remarkably close to Achaeans, which was one of the words the Greeks used for themselves. So in these dry diplomatic documents we may have a faint outside echo of the same world Homer described, the world of Troy and the seafaring Greeks who menaced its coast. The most charming detail of all is the name of one Wilusan king recorded in a Hittite treaty. He was called Alexandru. To Greek ears, that is almost exactly the name Alexandros, which happens to be the other name the poems give to Hector's troublesome brother Paris. Whether this is a genuine connection or a happy coincidence, no one can prove. But it is the kind of small thread that makes scholars sit up, because it suggests that the names in the legend were not invented from nothing. The Troy that the Bronze Age left behind was not built all at once. The mound at Hisarlik is made up of at least 9 main cities stacked on top of one another, each one given a number by archaeologists, running from the earliest and deepest up to the latest near the surface. The grandest and most heavily fortified of these, with the impressive walls and towers, is the level usually called Troy 6. It looks every bit the part of Homer's mighty city, but it appears to have been damaged by an earthquake rather than by an army, which is awkward for the legend. The level above it, Troy 7, is less grand but shows clearer signs of violent destruction, including burned buildings, scattered weapons, and what look like hastily stored supplies, the sort of thing a population does when it expects a siege. Many scholars now suspect that if any real conflict lies behind the Trojan War, it belongs to this layer, somewhere around 1200 or 1300 BC. The truth is probably a blend. with the splendour of one Troy and the destruction of another fused together in memory over the long centuries of storytelling. It is worth pausing on the man who found all this, because his story is a small comedy of its own. Heinrich Schliemann was a self-made businessman who had grown rich and then decided to spend his fortune proving that Homer was telling the truth. He arrived at his Sarlik with enormous energy, very little patience, and a deep conviction that the real Troy must lie at the very bottom of the mound. So he drove a great trench straight down through the centre of the hill, hauling out the upper layers in his hurry to reach the deepest one. In doing so, he tore through and damaged the very level that most experts now think was the Troy he was looking for. He went searching for Homer's city and nearly demolished it before he recognized it. For Hector, none of these debates would have meant anything. He lived inside the legend, not the excavation report. To him, Troy was simply home. It was the wind off the water and the smell of horses on the plain. It was the great gate in the western wall, the one the poets called the Scaean Gate, through which the army marched out and, on bad days, came running back in. It was the towers where the women watched the fighting, the crowded streets of the lower town, and the palace of his father on the height. He had grown up climbing those walls as a boy and had come to know every weak point and every strong one, which is the kind of knowledge that matters enormously when an enemy is camped on your doorstep. This was the city he was born to protect. It was old, it was rich, it was clever in the way it sat astride the sea lanes, and it had survived earthquakes and rivals for centuries. None of that would save it. But before the end came, it would give the world a story that the world has never managed to forget, and it would give that story a defender worth remembering. The House of Priam. Hector belonged to one of the largest and most storied families in the ancient imagination. His father was Priam, the king of Troy, and Priam's own life had already taught the family a hard lesson about how quickly a city could fall, and how a single act of mercy could change a destiny. Long before Hector was born, Troy had been ruled by Priam's father, a king named Laomedon. Laomedon was clever and ambitious, but also famously untrustworthy, the kind of man who made deals and then refused to pay what he owed. He cheated the wrong powers once too often, and the result was disaster. The great hero Heracles, wronged by Laomedon, gathered a small force, attacked the city, and broke through its defences. Troy fell, Laomedon was killed, and the royal household was nearly wiped out. Among the survivors was a young prince, the boy who would one day be Priam. In that first sack of Troy, he was taken captive along with his sister Hesione. According to the old tradition, Hesione was given the chance to save one prisoner, and she chose her young brother, buying his freedom with her veil. From that act of ransom, the boy took a new name. He had been called Podarces, but afterward he was known as Priam, a name the storytellers linked to the idea of being bought back, of being ransomed. It is a small detail, easy to pass over, but it sits at the very root of his story, because the most famous thing Priam would ever do, at the very end, was to ransom back something he loved beyond price. The man whose own life had been redeemed would one day go begging to redeem his dead son. After the first fall of Troy, Priam rebuilt. He restored the walls, repopulated the city, and over a long and stable reign turned Troy back into the wealthy and respected place it had been. He grew old as a king should, surrounded by family and honoured by his people, and for many years it must have seemed that the earlier catastrophe had been left safely in the past. Priam became known across the region not as a tyrant, but as a generous and dignified ruler, a man other kings spoke of with respect. That reputation matters, because it tells us something about the household Hector grew up in. He was not raised by a cruel father obsessed with conquest. He was raised by an old and careful king who had personally watched his own city burn and had spent a lifetime making sure it never happened again. Priam's wife and queen was Hecuba, a woman of high birth and strong will. She was the mother of Hector and of many of Priam's other children, and she would become one of the most tragic figures in the whole story. a queen who lived long enough to lose nearly everything she had. The royal family was enormous. The tradition credits Priam with 50 sons and a great many daughters, born to Hecuba and to other women of the household. Some of these children are only names in a long list. Others became central to the tale, and a few of them carried gifts and curses that shaped the fate of the city. The most important of all, of course, was Hector, the eldest and the steadiest, marked from early on as the heir and the natural leader. But his siblings were a remarkable and troubled group. There was Cassandra, his sister, who was said to have been given the gift of true prophecy by the god Apollo. She could see what was coming with perfect clarity. The cruelty in her story is that the same god, angered by her, added a curse to the gift, so that although every prediction she made was true, no one would ever believe her. She would spend her life telling her family exactly what disasters lay ahead, and being dismissed as mad for it. There was also Helenus, who shared something of that prophetic talent, and Deiphobus, a capable fighter who would later play his own part near the end. There was young Troilus, whose early death was woven into the legends, and Polyxena, a daughter whose fate would be bound up in the war's grim conclusion. Another daughter, Creusa, would marry a Trojan prince named Aeneas, and through their bloodline the legend would eventually reach all the way to the founding myths of Rome. And then there was Paris. Paris was the brother whose birth had been shadowed by a warning. Before he was born, while Hecuba was still carrying him, she had a disturbing dream. In the dream she gave birth not to a child but to a blazing torch, a flaming brand that spread fire through the whole city until Troy itself was consumed. Troubled, the royal couple turned to those who claimed to read such signs, and the answer they received was bleak. The child she carried would one day bring about the destruction of Troy. To a king who had already seen his city fall once, this was the worst news imaginable. What followed was the kind of decision that ancient stories are full of, and that no parent could make lightly. Rather than raise a child fated to destroy them, the family chose to be rid of him. The infant Paris was carried out of the city and left exposed on the slopes of Mount Ida, the wooded mountain that rose behind Troy, abandoned to die of cold and hunger as the wilderness took its course. By every expectation, that should have been the end of him. But the baby did not die. In the way these tales so often go, he was found and kept alive, first sheltered by animals in some versions, and then raised by a shepherd who took pity on him. He grew up on the mountain, strong and handsome, herding cattle and knowing nothing of the palace below or the prophecy that had cast him out. The danger the family had tried so hard to remove was simply biding its time, a few hours' walk up the hill. Against this crowded and uneasy background, Hector stands out for his ordinariness in the best sense of the word. He was not marked by a prophecy or gifted by a god. He had no curse and no secret. He was simply the reliable one, the son who did what was needed and could be trusted with responsibility. While Cassandra unsettled people with visions no one wanted to hear, and while the lost brother grew up far away with disaster sleeping in him, Hector took on the steady work of a crown prince. He learned to fight, to command, and to govern. He married and started a family of his own. He earned the respect of the city's older men, the council of elders who advised the king, and he won the loyalty of the soldiers who would one day follow him into battle. The court he served in was not a closed world. Troy stood at the meeting point of many peoples, and it kept friendships and alliances across a wide stretch of Asia Minor and the islands. When the war finally came, those alliances would matter enormously, drawing fighters from distant lands to stand on the Trojan side. Among them would be men like Sarpedon and Glaucus, leaders of the Lycians from the southern coast, who came a long way to fight in a quarrel that was not originally theirs. The defence of Troy would never be the work of one family alone, but it would always have one family at its centre, and one man within that family carrying the most weight. So this was Hector's house, as the old tellers gave it to us, a father who had been ransomed back from ruin and had spent his life rebuilding, a mother who would outlive almost all her children, a sister who could see the future and could never be believed, a scattering of brothers, some brave, some doomed, and one of them raised in secret on a mountain with the seed of catastrophe inside him. Into this family, Hector was born as the steady centre, the son everyone leaned on, the one expected to hold it all together. For a long time, that is exactly what he did. But the brother on the mountain was about to come home, and when he did, he would bring the prophecy down with him. A brother's reckless gift. The trouble that would destroy Troy began, as serious trouble often does, with a party. The story goes that the gods held a great wedding feast for a sea goddess named Thetis and a mortal man named Peleus. It was a glittering occasion, and nearly every divine being was invited. The one deliberately left off the guest list was Eris, the goddess associated with strife and discord, for the obvious reason that nobody wants discord at a wedding. Eris took the snub badly. She arrived anyway, and rather than make a scene, she simply rolled a single golden apple into the middle of the celebration. On it were inscribed 2 words, meaning "for the fairest." Then she left, having calculated that the apple would do far more damage than she ever could in person. She was right. 3 of the most powerful goddesses each claimed the apple as her own. Hera, the queen of the gods, Athena, the goddess of wisdom and warfare, and Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. None would yield, and the quarrel grew so bitter that it reached Zeus himself, the king of the gods. Zeus was wise enough to want nothing to do with it. Choosing between his wife, his daughter, and the goddess of love was a contest with no winners, so he passed the decision down to a mortal. The mortal he chose was a young man living quietly on Mount Ida, a herdsman with a reputation for fair judgment, who happened to be the lost prince of Troy. The gods came down to Paris and asked him to decide which of them was the fairest. Each goddess tried to win his vote with a gift. Hera offered him power, rule over great kingdoms and wide lands. Athena offered him wisdom and unbeatable skill in war. Aphrodite offered him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, faced with a choice between power, wisdom, and a beautiful woman, chose the woman, which tells you most of what you need to know about the war that followed. There was one large problem with Aphrodite's gift. The most beautiful woman in the world was already married. Her name was Helen, and she was the wife of Menelaus, the king of Sparta in southern Greece. Helen was the daughter of Zeus and a mortal queen, and her beauty had been famous since girlhood. When she had first reached the age to marry, so many kings and princes had come seeking her hand that her family feared violence among the rejected suitors. To prevent it, they had required every suitor to swear a solemn oath promising that whoever Helen married, all the rest would defend that marriage and come to the husband's aid if anyone ever tried to take her away. The suitors swore it. Helen married Menelaus, and the others went home. That oath, made years earlier to keep the peace, was about to bind nearly every powerful man in Greece to a single cause. While all this was being set in motion by the gods, Paris was finally coming home. He returned to Troy by chance, taking part in athletic games the city was holding, and proved so impressive that he drew attention. In the way of such tales, his identity was uncovered. His sister Cassandra recognized him, and his mother knew her lost child. The old prophecy should have been ringing in everyone's ears at that moment. Here was the very baby who had been left on the mountain to die because he was fated to burn the city down, walking back through the gates as a handsome grown man. And yet Priam and Hecuba, overjoyed to have a son return to them, welcomed him back into the family. It is hard to blame parents for embracing a child they thought was dead. It is also hard not to notice that the entire disaster could have been avoided right there, and was not. Restored to his place as a prince of Troy, Paris soon set out across the sea to Sparta, sailing into the heart of the very people who would one day besiege his home. He was received by Menelaus as an honoured guest. This matters more than it might seem, because in that world the bond between a host and a guest was close to sacred. A host who took in a traveller was bound to protect and feed him, and a guest was bound to honour his host's household and harm nothing within it. This was the ancient law of hospitality, and breaking it was considered one of the gravest of all offences, the kind that invited divine punishment. Menelaus treated Paris generously, then left on a journey, trusting his guest in his absence. That trust was exactly what Paris destroyed. While Menelaus was away, Paris took Helen and a quantity of the household's treasure and sailed with her back to Troy. Whether Helen went willingly, swept up by Aphrodite's promise, or whether she was carried off against her will, the old tradition never fully decides, and storytellers have argued about it ever since. What is not in doubt is the insult. Paris had abused the hospitality of a king, stolen his wife and his wealth, and sailed home as though he had won a prize rather than committed a crime. When the ships reached Troy with Helen aboard, the prophecy that the family had tried so hard to escape had in effect walked in through the front gate. Menelaus returned to find his wife gone and his honour in ruins. He went straight to his brother, Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae and the most powerful ruler in Greece. Agamemnon was a hard and ambitious man, and a war against wealthy Troy may have suited his own purposes as much as his brother's grievance. He invoked the old oath of the suitors, calling on every king who had sworn to defend Helen's marriage. One by one, across the Greek world, the great men assembled their ships and their warriors until a fleet of enormous size had gathered, ready to cross the sea and take Helen back by force. Before the fighting started, there was a chance to avoid it. The Greeks sent an embassy to Troy, with Menelaus himself and the clever Odysseus among the envoys, to demand Helen's peaceful return. This was the moment when cooler heads in Troy might have ended the whole affair before a single soldier died. Some within the city argued exactly that, urging that Helen and the stolen treasure be given back and the Greeks sent home satisfied. It was the sensible course, and it failed. Paris refused to give up the woman he had crossed the sea to win, and the pride of the city closed ranks behind him. The envoys were sent away empty-handed, and with them went the last real chance of peace. Through all of this, Hector watched his brother's recklessness with a steady and growing dread. He had not chosen the apple, judged the goddesses, sailed to Sparta, or stolen anyone's wife. He had argued against the war that everyone could now see approaching. And yet he understood, with the clear eyes of a man who knew his duty, that none of that would matter once the Greek fleet arrived. The city would not, and could not, hand his brother over to the enemy. Family and pride and the law of the gods all pulled the same way. Whatever Hector thought of Paris in private, in public he would stand beside him, because that was what the heir of Troy was bound to do. It is one of the quieter tragedies in the whole story. The man who would do the most to defend Troy was the man least responsible for the danger it was in. Hector did not start the fire. He had simply been born into the house that was going to burn, and he had been raised to be the one who tried to put it out. As the news spread that the Greeks were coming, that the largest army anyone had ever seen was loading its ships and pointing them across the water, Hector did not waste his energy on blame. There would be no use in it. Instead, he began doing what he had always done, which was to prepare, to organize, and to make ready to stand in front of his people when the trouble his brother had brought finally landed on the beach below the walls. 1,000 ships on the horizon. Gathering an army to cross the sea was, in that age, an enormous undertaking, and it did not go smoothly. The Greek forces assembled at a harbour called Aulis, hundreds of ships drawn from dozens of kingdoms, and there they sat, because the winds would not let them sail. The fleet was trapped by the same kind of weather that had always made these waters treacherous, and the longer it waited, the more restless and quarrelsome the men became. The price the Greek commander Agamemnon was said to have paid to free the winds was a terrible one, the sacrifice of his own daughter, an act that would poison his household for the rest of his life. Whatever the truth behind that grim legend, it captures something real about the venture. This war demanded sacrifices before it had even begun, and the people who started it paid prices they could never take back. When the fleet finally crossed, it came in a number that has echoed down the centuries. The old poems list the contingents one by one, kingdom by kingdom, in a long roll call that scholars call the catalogue of ships, and it adds up to well over 1,000 vessels. Whether that figure is anywhere near accurate, no one knows, but the idea of 1,000 ships stuck fast in the imagination. Curiously, the single most famous phrase attached to Helen, the line about the face that launched 1,000 ships, was not written by Homer at all. It was coined more than 2,000 years later by an English playwright named Christopher Marlowe, who put it into a play about an entirely different legend. Helen became forever linked to a number that a man in Elizabethan England came up with long after everyone involved had turned to dust. The leaders who sailed under Agamemnon were a formidable group, and their names matter, because Hector would face many of them across the plain. There was Menelaus, the wronged husband, the whole reason given for the war. There was Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, famous not for his strength but for his cleverness, a man who would eventually find the trick that brute force never could. There was Diomedes, young and ferocious. There were two warriors who shared the name Ajax, one enormous and immovable, the other quick and fierce. There was old Nestor, far past his fighting prime but valued for his memory and his counsel. And above all there was Achilles, the leader of a hard band of fighters called the Myrmidons, and by common agreement the deadliest warrior alive. Achilles was the figure the whole Greek war effort would come to revolve around, and he was the one man Hector had real reason to fear. The landing on the Trojan shore was marked by an omen that set the tone for everything to come. A prophecy had warned that the first Greek to step onto Trojan soil would be the first to die. For a while this made everyone hesitate, since no one wanted the honour of being killed first. At last a warrior named Protesilaus leapt down onto the beach, fully aware of what the prophecy promised, and he was indeed cut down almost at once, in some tellings by Hector's own hand. It was a small, sharp beginning to a very long war, and it announced that the Trojans did not intend to sit meekly behind their walls. That last point is important, because the Trojan War was not the kind of siege most people picture. It was not 10 straight years of men hurling themselves against the gates. The walls of Troy were simply too strong for that, and the Greeks knew it. Instead, the war settled into something slower and grinding. The Greeks dragged their ships up onto the beach and built a fortified camp of their own, protected by a ditch and a rough wall, turning the shoreline into a temporary city of tents and timber. From there they raided up and down the coast, attacking the smaller towns allied with Troy, seizing cattle, grain and captives to keep themselves supplied. The Trojans, for their part, did not stay shut inside. They came out through the great western gate and met the Greeks on the wide plain between the city and the sea, and it was there, on that open ground, that most of the fighting happened. So the war became a contest of endurance. Year after year the two sides bled each other on the plain, neither able to win a decisive victory. The Greeks could not break the walls. The Trojans could not drive the invaders back into the sea. Between the set battles there were long stretches of waiting, of disease in the crowded camp, of foraging and boredom and slow attrition. A whole decade of life unfolded in the shadow of that stalemate. Children who had been infants when the ships arrived were growing up inside a city at war, knowing nothing else. Men aged on both sides. The original quarrel over one stolen woman hardened into something larger and grimmer, a war that had taken on a life of its own and no longer needed its original reason to keep going. Through all of this, Hector became the heart of the Trojan defence. He was the commander of the army, responsible not only for the soldiers of Troy itself, but for the many allied contingents who had come from across the region to fight beside them. Leading such a mixed force was no small task. These were men from different lands, with different languages and loyalties, and holding them together through a war that dragged on for years required steadiness, fairness, and a reputation worth following. Hector had all three. He was the one who organised the sallies out onto the plain, who decided when to press and when to pull back inside the walls, who rallied the line when it wavered. The other Trojan leaders had their strengths, but it was Hector the army looked to, and Hector the city trusted. His position was harder than that of his Greek counterparts in one crucial way. The Greeks could afford to lose battles. If they were beaten back, they retreated to their ships and lived to fight again. Far from their own homes and families, Hector had no such cushion. Behind him stood the actual city, with his parents in the palace, his wife and infant son in their home, and tens of thousands of ordinary people whose survival depended on the wall holding. Every time he led the army out, he was gambling with everything he loved. A Greek defeat meant a bad day. A Trojan defeat, a serious one, could mean the end of the world they knew. It says a great deal about him that he carried this weight without bitterness toward the people who had placed it on his shoulders. He never seems to have abandoned his brother, never refused his duty, never tried to slip away from the responsibility that fate and family had handed him. He simply got up, put on his armour, and went out to do the job day after day for 10 years. There is no glamour in that kind of persistence. It is the opposite of the flashing heroics that the poems usually celebrate. But it is the quality that made Hector the man the city could not do without, and it is the reason that when the war finally reached its turning point, everything would come down to whether he could keep standing. By the start of the 10th year, both sides were exhausted, and the long deadlock was about to break. Not because the walls had been breached, and not because some grand strategy had finally worked, but because of a bitter quarrel that erupted inside the Greek camp itself. That quarrel, between Agamemnon and Achilles, would set in motion the chain of events that the Iliad actually describes, and it would give Hector the greatest opportunity and the greatest danger of his life. For a brief and shining stretch, with the deadliest Greek warrior sitting out the fight in anger, the war would tilt in Troy's favour, and Hector would come closer than ever before to driving the invaders into the sea. Andromache and the child. For all his importance to the war, the most revealing parts of Hector's story are the quiet ones, and the quietest of all involve his wife. Her name was Andromache, and she came to Troy from a city called Thebe, a town in the same region, where her father Eetion had been king. Her life before her marriage had not been spared by the war. The same Greek army that now besieged Troy had earlier attacked her home, and the warrior who led that attack was Achilles. In a single assault, Achilles had killed her father and all 7 of her brothers, and her mother had been taken captive before dying soon after. Andromache had lost her entire birth family to the very man who now stood on the plain outside her new home. Everything she had left in the world was bound up in Hector. He was not only her husband, he had become, in a real sense, her whole family, the single person standing between her and a fate she understood all too well. That understanding shaped everything about her. Andromache was not a woman who had to imagine what defeat would look like. She had already lived through the fall of a city once. She knew that when a town was taken, the men were killed and the women were carried off to serve their conquerors, to spin wool and draw water in the houses of strangers far from home. She knew exactly what would happen to her if Hector fell, because she had watched it happen to others. This knowledge gave her fears a weight that other people's did not have. When she begged Hector to be careful, to fight defensively, to think of what would become of her and their child, she was not being timid. She was being clear-eyed about a future she could see coming. Their son was still a baby, small enough to be carried by his nurse. Hector had named him Scamandrius, after the river that ran across the Trojan plain, but the people of the city had given him a different name. They called him Astyanax, which meant something like Lord of the City, because his father was the man who guarded the city, and a grateful people wanted to honour that in the child. It is a small detail that tells you how much the ordinary Trojans loved Hector. They named his son after the thing he did for them. The most famous moment in all of Hector's domestic life took place during one of his brief returns inside the walls. He came upon Andromache, and the baby near the great gate took a moment away from the war to be with them and reached out to hold his son. But the child took one look at his father and burst into frightened tears because Hector was in full armour, and the tall horsehair crest on his bronze helmet, nodding and bristling above him, terrified the infant. So Hector laughed, lifted the helmet from his head, and set it down gleaming on the ground, and only then, with his face bare and familiar, could he take his son into his arms. It is a tiny scene, almost nothing, a father removing a scary hat so his baby will come to him, and yet it has survived for 3,000 years, because anyone who has ever held a frightened child recognizes it at once. In the middle of the greatest war story of the ancient world, the thing people remember best is a man taking off his helmet to comfort his son. This was the life Hector was fighting to protect, and it is worth pausing to picture the world that life was lived in, because it was very different from our own. Trojan society, like the wider Bronze Age world around it, was sharply divided by rank, and where you stood determined nearly everything about how you lived. At the top were the royal family and the noble houses, who lived in the citadel near the palace. They wore garments of fine woolen linen, dyed in colours that were costly to produce, and they fastened their cloaks with pins and brooches of bronze and gold. They owned jewellery, drinking cups of precious metal, and finely made furniture, and at their feasts they ate roasted meat, beef and mutton and pork, washed down with wine. Meat was a mark of status precisely because most people rarely had it. To eat roasted ox regularly was to announce that you were someone of importance. Just below the highest nobles came the warriors and charioteers, and here wealth and war were tightly linked. A full set of bronze armour, a helmet, a breastplate, greaves for the shins, a large shield, and good weapons represented a fortune. Bronze was expensive, and the skill to work it was rare, so only a well-off man could equip himself to fight in the front rank. The gleaming heroes of the poems were, in plain terms, the people rich enough to afford the gear. Below them were the free craftsmen and traders who kept a wealthy port city running, the potters and metalworkers, the merchants who handled the goods passing through, and the scribes and officials who kept records for the palace. Then came the great mass of ordinary people, the farmers, herders, fishermen and labourers who fed everyone else. They lived in the lower town and the surrounding countryside, in simpler houses, and they wore plain, undyed wool. Their food was the food of the many rather than the few. The staple was bread, made from barley and wheat, eaten with olives and olive oil, cheese from sheep and goats, figs and other fruit, beans and onions, and fish from the nearby sea. They drank wine too, but watered down and of lesser quality. Meat, for them, mostly appeared on feast days and at religious sacrifices, when an animal was offered to the gods and the people shared in the roasted remains. Weaving filled the women's days at every level of society, the loom being one of the central objects of any household, and the cloth they produced clothed the family and, in wealthier homes, became valuable goods in its own right. At the very bottom were the slaves, and most of them had become slaves the same way Andromache feared she would. They were captives of war, men and sometimes women taken when a town was sacked, set to labour in the fields and the households of their captors. A captured noblewoman might spend the rest of her life weaving cloth for the wife of the man who had killed her husband. This was not a distant abstraction in Troy. It was the lived reality at the bottom of the very society Hector belonged to, and it was the precise future hanging over his own wife if the war went badly. The grim machinery of that world made his private fears and his public duty into the same thing. To protect his family was to keep them out of the lowest rank of all. So when Hector said his farewells at the gate and turned back toward the plain, he was not leaving behind some vague idea of home. He was leaving a real woman who had already buried one family and dreaded burying another, and a small son frightened of helmets, in a city full of people who had named that child after him out of love. Andromache watched him go with the particular dread of someone who knew the odds and knew the cost. She had asked him to fight carefully, to stay near the walls, to remember that the city needed him alive more than it needed him brave. Hector understood her fear and shared it. But he also knew that a commander who hid behind his own walls while others died would not be a commander for long, and would not deserve the name his people had given his son. So he went out, again, as he always did, carrying the whole weight of that quiet household out onto the open field where the war was waiting, the day the Greeks ran. The opening that Hector had waited 10 years for came not from any Trojan victory, but from a falling out inside the enemy's own camp. The trouble began with a plague that swept through the Greek army, sent, they believed, because Agamemnon had insulted a priest of Apollo by refusing to return the man's captured daughter. To lift the plague, Agamemnon was forced to give the girl back, and his pride could not bear to lose his prize while others kept theirs. So he took compensation from the one man least likely to accept it, seizing a captive woman named Briseis who had been awarded to Achilles. To Achilles, this was an unforgivable public humiliation. He was the greatest fighter in the army, the man who won the battles, and the commander had treated him like a servant whose property could be confiscated at will. In cold fury, Achilles withdrew. He pulled himself and his myrmidons out of the war entirely, and announced that he would sit by his ships while the Greeks learned how much they needed him. That withdrawal changed everything. Achilles, grieving over his lost honour, asked his mother, the sea goddess Thetis, to use her influence with the gods so that the Greeks would suffer for what their king had done. She went to Zeus and won his promise that the tide of battle would turn against the Greeks until they were made to feel the absence of the man they had wronged. From that moment, the most powerful force in the universe was, for its own reasons, tilting the war toward Troy, and the Trojan best positioned to seize that advantage was Hector. He took to the field with a new boldness. Rather than the usual grinding clashes, Hector proposed a contest that appealed to the warrior pride of both sides. He challenged the Greeks to send out their best man to face him alone, one champion against another, with the whole army watching. The Greeks hesitated at first, none eager to step forward against him, until lots were cast and the duty fell to Ajax, the larger of the two warriors who shared that name, a man built like a wall and famous for never giving ground. The two of them fought a long and punishing duel on the open plain. They threw spears that pierced shields, they took up massive stones and hurled them at each other, and they closed with swords, and still neither man could overcome the other. They were too evenly matched, and as darkness came on, heralds from both sides stepped in to separate them, declaring the contest a draw. What happened next says more about Hector than any victory could. Rather than parting in hatred, the two enemies exchanged gifts. In recognition that each had met a worthy opponent, Hector gave Ajax his fine sword, and Ajax gave Hector his war belt. It was an act of respect across the battle line, the kind of gesture that reveals a man's character, and Hector made it without hesitation towards someone who had been trying to kill him all afternoon. There is a dark thread in those particular gifts that the old listeners would have felt coming, since both objects would reappear at the worst moments of each man's story. But on that evening it was simply two great fighters acknowledging one another and walking away alive. With Achilles still absent, and the gods leaning his way, Hector pressed his advantage harder than he ever had before. Day after day he led the Trojans forward, and for the first time in 10 years they did not merely hold the plain, they took it. They pushed the Greeks back across the open ground, past the places where so many indecisive battles had been fought, and drove them all the way to the line they had built to protect their ships. The Greeks had dug a ditch and raised a rough wall around their beached fleet, a last barrier between the enemy and the vessels that were their only way home. Now that barrier was all that stood between Troy and total victory, and Hector threw himself against it. He broke it. In the climax of his great run of success, Hector reached the gate of the Greek wall, took up a stone so large that the poet said 2 ordinary men could not have lifted it, and hurled it against the doors. The gate shattered, the timbers gave way, and the Trojans poured through the gap into the camp itself. The Greeks, the proud army that had crossed the sea to destroy Troy, were now fighting for their lives among their own tents, pinned with their backs to the water. Hector called for fire. If the Trojans could set the ships alight, the Greeks would have no escape and no way to bring reinforcements, and the war would be over. For one extraordinary stretch, it genuinely looked as though Hector, the defender who had spent a decade keeping disaster at bay, might actually win the whole thing. This was the high point of his life, and it was also the point where a flaw in him began to show. Success made Hector bold, and boldness shaded into something closer to overconfidence. He had a friend and advisor named Polydamas, a thoughtful man born, the tradition says, on the very same night as Hector, who had a gift for reading a situation soberly. More than once during this period, Polydamas urged caution. He warned that pushing too far carried risks, that the gods who favoured Troy today might not favour it tomorrow, and at a crucial moment he advised pulling the army back inside the safe shelter of the city walls, rather than camping out on the open plain in reach of the enemy. It was sensible counsel from a sensible man. Hector, riding high on victory and certain that fortune was finally his, brushed it aside. He had the Greeks on the ropes, and he was not about to retreat now. It is easy to understand why. For 10 years he had carried the burden of a defensive war he had not chosen, watching friends die in a stalemate that never seemed to end. Now, at last, he had the enemy beaten and the prize within reach. To pull back at such a moment would have felt like cowardice, like throwing away the one chance the city had been given. Hector chose to press on, and in that choice you can see both his courage and the beginning of his undoing. The same drive that made him refuse to hide behind his walls, the same refusal to be cautious when his people needed boldness, was about to lead him a single step too far. For now, though, the Trojan army stood among the enemy ships with torches in their hands, and the Greeks were closer to ruin than they had ever been. Hector had done what no one thought possible. He had turned a hopeless decade-long siege into a near victory, and he had done it largely on his own strength and will, with the help of a quarrel he had not started, and gods whose favour he could not have predicted. The men of Troy, who followed him that day, must have believed the long ordeal was finally ending in their favour, that they would watch the Greek ships burn and the survivors flee, and that Hector would go down as the man who saved the city. What none of them could see was that the very success pinning the Greeks against their ships was about to summon the one disaster Hector could not survive. The sight of the fleet in flames would not break the Greeks. It would break the spell that had kept their greatest warrior sitting in his tent. Achilles had sworn not to fight, and he would keep that oath a little longer. But he could not watch the ships burn and do nothing, and the choice he made to satisfy both his pride and his conscience would put a different man in his armour, send him out onto the field, and set in motion the chain of grief that would bring Achilles roaring back into the war and straight toward Hector. The fall of Patroclus. While Hector pressed his attack on the ships, the man who would undo him was not Achilles but Achilles' dearest companion, Patroclus. The two of them had grown up together and were closer than ordinary friends, bound by a lifetime of shared loyalty. Patroclus was the gentler of the pair, older and steadier, the one who softened Achilles' harder edges, and unlike Achilles, he could not sit by his tent and watch the Greek army being slaughtered. As the Trojans set the first ships ablaze and the wounded streamed back through the camp, Patroclus could bear it no longer. He went to Achilles in tears, distraught at the suffering of men he had fought beside for 10 years. The bond between Achilles and Patroclus was so intense that the ancient Greeks themselves argued for centuries over whether the two were companions or lovers, a question that was debated openly in antiquity and has never been settled since. Whatever the exact nature of it, the love was real and total, and it was about to become the lever that moved the entire war. Patroclus made Achilles a proposal. If Achilles was still too wounded in his pride to fight, then he should at least let Patroclus take his place. Patroclus would borrow Achilles' own armour, the famous unmistakable panoply that every Trojan would recognize and lead the Myrmidons out himself. The mere sight of that armour, he reasoned, might be enough to make the Trojans think Achilles had returned, breaking their nerve and giving the exhausted Greeks a chance to drive them back from the ships. Achilles, moved by his friend's distress but still unwilling to bend his oath, agreed. He gave Patroclus the armour and the command of his men, but he attached a strict and specific limit to the favour. Patroclus was to save the ships and push the Trojans back across the plain, and then he was to stop. He was not, under any circumstances, to chase the enemy all the way to the walls of Troy. He was to drive them off and come straight back. Achilles, for all his rage, understood the dangers of the field better than anyone, and he could see exactly how a man might be carried away by success into a place he could not survive. For a while the plan worked beautifully. Patroclus put on the gleaming armour, the Myrmidons formed up fresh and eager behind him, and they swept out into the fighting like a sudden change in the weather. The Trojans, seeing that dreaded armour advancing, did exactly what Patroclus had hoped. They panicked, convinced that Achilles himself had finally returned to the war. Their nerve broke, and the great surge that had carried them all the way to the ships reversed. The fires were put out, the fleet was saved, and Patroclus drove the Trojans back across the plain in a headlong retreat. In a single afternoon, the near-victory Hector had spent days building came apart. And then Patroclus made the mistake Achilles had warned him against. Intoxicated by his own success, with the enemy fleeing before him, he forgot the limit he had been given. Instead of stopping once the ships were safe, he pursued the broken Trojans across the whole length of the plain, killing as he went. He cut down many men, and among them was one of the greatest of the Trojan allies, Sarpedon, a leader of the Lycians and a son of Zeus himself. Sarpedon had come a long way from his southern homeland to fight in this war, and now he fell far from it. The death of his own son grieved Zeus deeply, and there was a moment, the old story says, when the king of the gods considered snatching Sarpedon out of danger and saving him. In the end, he let fate take its course, as even he was bound to do, and the body of Sarpedon was carried home to Lycia by the twin powers of sleep and death for burial. Carried on by his triumph, Patroclus did the very thing he had been forbidden to do. He drove the Trojans all the way back to the walls of Troy and threw himself against them, trying to scale the city itself. The poems say he tried 3 times to mount the Great Wall, and 3 times he was thrown back, not by any soldier but by the god Apollo, who stood guarding the city and would not let it fall to him. The 4th time, Apollo warned him off in a voice that turned his blood cold, and Patroclus drew back, but the warning came too late to save him. He had gone too far, into a place where the gods themselves were against him. What followed was death by stages, the way the old tradition often arranged the fall of an important man. Apollo came up behind Patroclus, unseen in the press of battle, and struck him a stunning blow, knocking the helmet from his head and loosening the armour on his body, leaving him dazed and exposed. While he stood helpless, a Trojan fighter named Euphorbus drove a spear into his back. Only then, with Patroclus already broken and reeling, did Hector close in. He stepped forward and finished him with a thrust of his own spear, and Patroclus fell. So Hector won the kill, but he won it against a man the gods had already shattered, and the dying Patroclus told him so. With his last breath, Patroclus warned Hector that his triumph would be brief, that Hector himself did not have long to live, and that Achilles would come for him. Hector dismissed the warning. He stripped the splendid armour of Achilles from the body of Patroclus and, in the most fateful gesture of his life, put it on himself, donning the gear of the very man who would soon hunt him down. A fierce struggle broke out over the corpse, for in that world the body of a fallen warrior was a prize, and to leave it to the enemy was a deep dishonour. The Greeks, with the great Ajax and Menelaus at the centre of the fight, battled desperately to recover the body of Patroclus, dragging it back at last toward their own lines while Hector kept the armour. It was a partial victory for each side, The Greeks saved their friend's body. Hector wore his enemy's armour. But the true outcome of that day had nothing to do with bodies or armour at all. The true outcome was that Hector had killed the one person on earth whose death would bring Achilles back into the war. Everything Agamemnon's insult had failed to do, everything the burning ships had nearly accomplished, was undone in an instant by this single death. Achilles had sworn not to fight while his honour went unanswered. But the loss of Patroclus was not a matter of honour. It was the loss of the person he loved most in the world, and no oath could hold against that grief. When the news reached him, Achilles collapsed in a despair so violent that those around him feared he would harm himself, and his cries of mourning carried all the way to his goddess mother in the depths of the sea. In that moment, the war changed direction for the final time. Achilles would fight again, not for Agamemnon, not for Helen, not for Greece, but for one dead friend and one revenge. Hector did not yet grasp what he had set in motion. He had every reason to feel that the day, despite its reversals, had ended in his favour. He had slain a great enemy champion and taken the armour of the deadliest man alive. But the warning of the dying Patroclus was about to come true with terrible precision. Somewhere across the plain in the Greek camp, the greatest warrior of the age was rising from his grief with a single name fixed in his mind. And from that moment, Hector was a man living on borrowed time. The return of Achilles. Grief reshaped Achilles into something the war had not yet seen. The man who had spent so long nursing his wounded pride now cast that quarrel aside as though it had never mattered. He sought out Agamemnon and let the feud drop. The captured woman who had started it was returned to him along with gifts of apology, but Achilles barely seemed to notice. The thing that had consumed him for so long, the insult to his honour, had been burned away by a larger fire. He no longer cared about Briseis or Agamemnon or the politics of the camp. He wanted only one thing, and that was Hector. There was a practical problem in his way. Achilles had no armour, because his own famous panoply was now being worn by the man he meant to kill. His mother, the sea goddess Thetis, solved this in the way that only a goddess could. She went to Hephaestus, the lame smith of the gods, the divine craftsman who worked metal no mortal forge could match, and asked him to make her son a new set of armour. Hephaestus agreed, and through the night he hammered out a panoply finer than anything that had ever existed. The centrepiece was a great shield, and the old account of that shield is one of the most remarkable passages to survive from the ancient world. On it, the smith god depicted not battles and glory, but the whole of ordinary human life. There were two cities, one at peace with weddings and lawsuits and dancing in the streets, and one at war under siege. There were fields being ploughed and harvested, a vineyard heavy with grapes, herds of cattle, a flock of sheep, young people dancing, and around the whole rim the great river of the world. It was a portrait of everything worth living for, forged to be carried into the killing of a man, which is the sort of bitter contrast the old poets understood, without ever pointing at it. When Achilles strode back onto the field in that gleaming new armour, the war stopped being a contest and became a slaughter. He cut through the Trojan ranks with a fury that nothing could stand against. Men who had held their ground for 10 years broke and ran at the sight of him. He drove the Trojans across the plain in a panic so complete that many of them fled toward the river that crossed the battlefield, the river the Trojans called the Scamander, and tried to escape across it or hide in its waters. Achilles followed them in, killing so many that the channel choked with the dead and the water ran red. The legend says the river itself rose up in anger, a god offended at being clogged with corpses, and turned its flood against Achilles, very nearly drowning him, before other gods intervened to save him. It is an extraordinary image, a single man so deadly that a river had to fight him, and it captures how the Trojans must have felt that day. They were no longer facing a warrior, they were facing a disaster. The gods, who had been meddling throughout the war, now threw themselves into the fighting on both sides, and the plain became a place of chaos where mortals and immortals clashed together. But none of it could slow Achilles for long. The Trojan army, which not many days earlier had stood triumphant among the enemy ships, was now in full flight toward the only refuge it had left, the city walls. From the towers, the people of Troy watched their soldiers come streaming back in terror, with the figure of Achilles cutting them down from behind. King Priam, watching from the wall, gave the order to open the great gates and let his fleeing army back in before Achilles could trap them all in the open. The gates were thrown wide, and the soldiers of Troy crowded through them to safety, gasping and broken, while the gods worked their tricks to delay Achilles just long enough for the bulk of the army to escape. And here the long shadow of an earlier decision fell across Hector. Back at the height of his success, when the Greeks were pinned against their ships, his wise friend Polydamas had urged him to bring the army back inside the protection of the walls rather than gamble everything on the open plain. Hector, certain that victory was within reach, had overruled him. Now, the cost of that choice was streaming past him in the form of his own routed soldiers, men who had died or fled because he had pushed too far when he should have pulled back. Hector understood this with painful clarity. The defeat unfolding before the walls was, in part, the result of his own overconfidence, and he knew it. That knowledge is what trapped him. As the last of the Trojan soldiers fled through the gates, Hector did not go with them. He could not bring himself to. The thought of walking back inside the safe walls now, after his refusal to retreat earlier had led so many men to their deaths, filled him with shame. He imagined facing Polydamas, who had given the right advice and been ignored. He imagined the ordinary Trojans, the very people who had named his son after him, looking at the commander who had thrown away their advantage and then saved his own skin while their husbands and sons lay dead on the plain. To a man whose entire identity was built on duty and on not flinching, the idea of sheltering behind the walls while bearing responsibility for the disaster was unbearable. He would rather face Achilles than face that shame. So Hector stayed outside. While his father and mother called down to him from the walls, begging him to come in, while the great gates stood open and safety waited just a few steps away, Hector remained on the plain, alone, in front of the city, turning the impossible choice over and over in his mind. He knew what Achilles was. He had seen the slaughter, the choked river, the broken army. He had been warned by a dying man that this day would come. Every practical consideration told him to go inside, to live, to defend the city from behind its strong walls as he had done for 10 years. But something deeper than calculation held him in place. He had made a costly mistake, and the only way he knew to answer for it was to stand and meet the consequence himself rather than let others keep paying for it. It was the kind of decision that defines a person. A cautious man would have stepped back through the gate and lived. A reckless man might have charged Achilles in a fury. Hector did neither. He simply stood his ground, weighing his duty against his fear, fully aware that the man coming toward him across the plain was the deadliest fighter who had ever lived, wearing new armour forged by a god, driven by a grief that nothing could satisfy except Hector's death. The dread that had been gathering over Troy for 10 years had narrowed to a single point. One man standing alone before the walls of his home, watching another man approach and choosing not to run. Inside the city, the people who loved him could only watch and plead. His parents, who had already feared this moment for years, now saw it arriving in real time and were powerless to stop it. The army he had led was safe behind the walls, leaving the man who had protected them all standing outside, exposed. And across the plain, closing the distance with the terrible certainty of a settled purpose, came Achilles, the new sun glinting on the shield that showed all the ordinary peaceful life that Hector was about to lose. Alone at the Scaean gate, from the top of the wall, Hector's parents made their last appeals. His father, Priam, the old king who had already lost his city once long ago, called down to his son, begging him not to throw his life away. reminding him that a living defender behind strong walls was worth more than a dead hero on the plain. His mother Hecuba pleaded in the rawest terms a mother can use, imploring him to take pity on the people who had raised him and come inside. Hector heard them both. He did not move. He stood before the Scaean Gate, the great western gate of Troy, and let the pleas wash over him while he tried to decide what an honourable man could do. He turned the choices over in his mind. He thought about laying down his shield and his spear and walking out to meet Achilles unarmed, to offer him terms. He could promise to hand back Helen and all the treasure Paris had stolen, and more besides, half the wealth of Troy, if only Achilles would call off the war. But Hector knew the offer was hopeless. Achilles was not interested in treasure or in ending the war. He wanted Hector dead, and he would cut him down, whether Hector came armed or came begging. There would be no bargaining with a man in that state of grief. So that path closed, and Hector was left with the only two real options he had ever had. Go inside and live with the shame, or stand and fight and probably die. And then something happened that the old poem records with unusual honesty. As Achilles came on, close enough now that the god-forged armour blazed and the great spear levelled toward him, the bravest man in Troy lost his nerve. Hector, who had held the line for 10 years, who had broken the Greek wall and burned toward their ships, was overcome by simple terror at the approach of Achilles, and he ran. This is one of the most human moments in the whole story, because it refuses to pretend that courage is the absence of fear. Hector fled, and Achilles chased him, and the two of them ran a full circuit around the walls of Troy, in plain sight of the entire city, the watchers on the towers following them with their eyes. They ran around the city not once but 3 times, the hunted and the hunter, neither able to gain on the other, while everyone Hector loved looked on. High above, the gods were watching too, and they came to a decision Hector could not appeal. Zeus, the king of the gods, took up his golden scales and weighed the fates of the 2 men, placing the doom of Hector in one pan and the doom of Achilles in the other. Hector's side sank down, the sign that his death had come due. With that, Apollo, the god who had protected Hector and the city throughout the war, withdrew his hand. The divine favour that had shielded the Trojans was lifted, and Hector was left with no protector among the gods, while his enemy had the goddess Athena working actively for his death. What Athena did next decided everything. She came down to the plain and took the shape of one of Hector's own brothers, Deiphobus, appearing at his side as if a kinsman had bravely come out from the city to stand with him against Achilles. To Hector, exhausted and cornered, this was the one thing that could change his mind. He was not alone after all. A brother had come to help him face the deadliest man alive. Heartened by the false support, Hector stopped running. He turned to face Achilles at last, believing he had an ally at his shoulder, ready now to fight rather than flee. The fight itself was short. Hector tried first to make a pact, proposing that whoever won should return the loser's body to his people for proper burial, sparing it from desecration. Achilles refused even that. He would make no agreement, grant no mercy, and offer no respect to the body of the man he meant to kill. Then the weapons flew. Achilles hurled his great spear, and Hector saw it coming and dropped beneath it, so that it flew over him and stuck in the ground. But Athena, unseen, plucked it up and returned it to Achilles, while Hector, not knowing this, believed his enemy was now without a spear. Hector threw his own, and it struck the centre of Achilles' shield, but the shield was the work of a god, and the spear glanced off it harmlessly. Hector turned to take a fresh weapon from his brother Deiphobus, and found no one there. The brother had never existed. In that instant Hector understood the whole of it. He had been deceived by a goddess, his real allies were all behind the walls, and the gods had marked him for death. He was utterly alone, and his end had come. What Hector did then is the reason he is remembered. He did not collapse, and he did not beg, and he did not run again. Knowing with complete certainty that he was going to die, that no help was coming, that the gods themselves had abandoned him, he chose how he would meet it. He drew his sword and charged straight at Achilles, deciding that if he had to die, he would die fighting, and leave behind a death that others would speak of rather than a death of flight. It was the clearest courage of his life, because it was courage with no hope attached to it. He was not fighting to win. He was fighting because facing the thing was better than running from it. Achilles met the charge knowing exactly where to strike. He was wearing his new armour, but Hector was wearing Achilles' old armour, the panoply taken from the body of Patroclus, and Achilles knew every weak point in it. There was a small gap at the throat, where the neck met the collarbone, left uncovered where the armour pieces joined. As Hector came on, Achilles drove his spear precisely into that opening, through the soft place above the breastplate, and the point passed through Hector's neck. Hector fell, struck down at the gate of his own city, mortally wounded but not yet dead. In his last moments, Hector made one final appeal, the same one his proposed pact had been meant to secure. He begged Achilles to take ransom for his body and return it to his father and mother, so that the people of Troy could give him the burial that the customs of that world demanded. Achilles answered with the full cruelty of his grief. He told Hector he would give him nothing, that no ransom would ever buy back the body, and that the dogs and the birds would tear it apart, while the man who had killed his beloved Patroclus lay unburied in the dirt. He said he wished his rage were savage enough to devour Hector himself. There was no mercy left in him at all. With his strength failing, Hector spoke once more, not to plead this time, but to warn. He told Achilles that his own death was not far off, that for all his fury he too was doomed, and that he would be brought down near this very gate by Paris and the god Apollo. It was the last true thing, Hector said, and it would come to pass, though he would not live to see it. Then the breath left him, and Hector, the defender of Troy, the steady son who had carried his city for 10 years, lay dead on the plain beneath the walls, with his parents watching from the towers and his enemy standing over him. The man who had taken off his helmet so his baby son would not be afraid had been killed at his own front gate, and his troubles, in a way, were over. The troubles of the people who loved him were only beginning, because Achilles had no intention of letting the matter rest with a clean death. What he did next would shock even the gods, and it would force an old king to do the bravest thing left in the whole story: the ransom and the ruin. Death did not bring Hector peace, because Achilles was not finished with him. After killing him at the gate, Achilles stripped away the armour, and then did something that horrified even the people of his own side. He pierced the tendons behind Hector's ankles, threaded a leather strap through them, and lashed the body to the back of his chariot. Then he whipped his horses forward and dragged Hector's corpse through the dust, head trailing on the ground, away from the walls and back toward the Greek camp. He did this in full view of the city. From the towers, Hector's father and mother saw their son hauled across the plain like a slaughtered animal, and their grief turned to something close to madness. Andromache learned of it last. She had been at home, deep in the inner rooms, weaving at her loom, and she had even ordered a hot bath made ready for her husband's return, not yet knowing he was dead. When the sound of wailing reached her from the walls, she ran out, and she saw Hector's body being dragged behind the chariot of Achilles. The future she had feared for years had arrived in an instant. The man who was her husband, her family, and her only protection was gone, and she understood at once what it meant for her and for their small son. Everything she had warned him about, all the dread she had carried, had come true in a single afternoon. Achilles did not stop with one desecration. Each morning for days he rose and dragged Hector's body around the burial mound of Patroclus, repeating the cruelty as if it could ease his grief, which of course it could not. But here the gods intervened in a quiet way. They protected Hector's body from harm, keeping it whole and undecayed despite the dragging and the days, so that it remained as it had been in life. The very fact that the corpse would not break or rot was a sign of divine displeasure. Even the gods who had favoured the Greeks were disturbed by the savagery, and at last Zeus decided it had gone too far. word came down from the gods on both sides. Achilles was told to accept a ransom and give the body back, and Priam, the old king of Troy, was told to go and get it. What followed is the heart of the whole story, the part that has moved listeners for 3,000 years. Priam, an old man who had already buried more children than he could count, loaded a wagon with a fortune in treasure and set out at night, alone except for a single driver, to travel from the safety of his city straight into the camp of his enemies. Guided through the dark by the god Hermes in disguise, he passed unseen through the Greek lines, slipped into the very tent of the man who had killed his son, and knelt down before him. What Priam did there required a kind of courage that has nothing to do with battle. He took the hands of Achilles, the same hands that had killed so many of his sons, and he kissed them. Then he begged for Hector's body, and he asked Achilles to think of his own aged father far away, who might at that very moment be longing for a son he would never see again. That appeal reached the one soft place left in Achilles. He thought of his own father, and of Patroclus, and the rage that had driven him for so long finally cracked. The two enemies, the old king and the young killer, wept together in the tent, each mourning his own dead. Then Achilles rose, accepted the ransom, and gave Hector's body back, washed and wrapped with his own hands, and granted a truce of several days so that Troy could bury its defender properly. It is one of the few moments in the entire tale where two enemies see each other simply as human beings, and it is the reason the story has lasted. Priam carried his son home, and Troy gave Hector the funeral his rank and his service deserved. The women of the city led the mourning, Andromache and Hecuba first, and then, remarkably, Helen, the very woman whose presence had brought the war. Helen wept for Hector because, she said, of all the people in Troy he had been the only one who had never spoken a harsh or unkind word to her, never blamed her for the disaster she had caused, always treating her with gentleness. That she of all people mourned him tells you what kind of man he had been. The Trojans built a great pyre, burned the body, gathered the bones into a golden chest, buried them, and raised a mound over the grave. Then they held a funeral feast in his honour, and there, with the burial of Hector, the Iliad ends. The most famous war story in history does not finish with the fall of Troy, or with the death of Achilles, or with any final battle. It finishes with the funeral of a man who lost. The very last line of the poem is simply a statement that this was the funeral of Hector, tamer of horses. Homer chose to end not on triumph but on a grave, which is its own kind of comment on what the whole thing had been worth. The rest came afterward, in other stories. Hector's dying warning proved exactly right. Before long, Achilles himself was killed near the Scaean Gate, struck down by an arrow from Paris guided by the god Apollo, dying within sight of the place where he had killed Hector. Paris did not long outlive him. And Troy, the city that had held for 10 years, finally fell not to force but to a trick. The Greeks pretended to sail away, leaving behind an enormous wooden horse as an apparent offering, with their best fighters hidden inside it. The city that had survived a decade of the greatest army in the world was undone by deciding to bring a large wooden horse indoors, which remains a fairly strong argument against accepting unexpected gifts. That night the hidden soldiers crept out, opened the gates, and let in the returning army, and Troy was sacked and burned at last. For Hector's family, the end was as cruel as Andromache had always feared. His infant son Astyanax, the child once frightened by a plumed helmet, was put to death by the conquering Greeks, thrown from the walls so that no heir of Hector would survive to grow up and seek revenge. Andromache herself was taken captive and carried off to Greece as the slave and concubine of the son of Achilles, the very household of the man who had killed her husband and her father. Hecuba was enslaved. Old Priam, the king who had ransomed back so much, was cut down at an altar during the sack. The royal house of Troy was destroyed almost to the last. Beneath all the legend, the archaeology tells a quieter but related story. The city on the mound at Hisarlik did fall, more than once, and one of those destructions, the burned layer that shows signs of violence and siege, lines up reasonably well with the traditional date of the Trojan War, somewhere around 1200 BC. That period was a terrible one across the whole eastern Mediterranean. Within a few generations, almost every great Bronze Age power collapsed in a wave of destruction that historians still struggle to fully explain. The Hittite Empire fell. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece burned and were abandoned. Writing itself was lost in some places for centuries. Troy, real or remembered, belonged to that vanished world, and when that world ended, the memory of its wars survived only as spoken tales, passed down for hundreds of years before Homer finally fixed them in verse. That is why Hector matters far beyond the question of whether he ever truly lived. He became the model of a certain kind of man, the defender who fights for his home rather than for conquest, who does his duty steadily even when he can see how it will end, who shows mercy to enemies and tenderness to his family. The Romans, who traced their own legend back to a Trojan survivor, kept his memory alive. Medieval writers counted him among the greatest heroes of all time. And he is still here, 3,000 years later, the man on the wall, remembered not because he won, but because of how he stood. Troy fell. Its kings were forgotten, and its language went silent, and its very location was doubted for centuries. But the image of one man stepping out before the gate of his doomed city, alone and unafraid, has outlasted every empire that ever tried to claim him, and it will very likely outlast ours as well. That brings the story of Hector to its close. He defended a city that could not be saved, and he is remembered for it more clearly than the men who burned it down. Are you still awake out there? If you are, there is another video waiting for you on the screen whenever you are ready to keep the journey going. And if you enjoyed this one, feel free to like and subscribe, or leave a thought down in the comments. But for now, there is nothing left to do. Settle in, close your eyes, and let yourself drift off to sleep. Good night, and sweet dreams.